Hey y'all, today we're going to go over the coagulation cascade. I'm going to go over the steps to it. I'm going to explain the reasons as to why the extrinsic pathway is activated as opposed to the intrinsic, as well as PT and PTT, which is the measurement for bleeding times for the extrinsic and intrinsic pathway respectively. So first off, we're going to start off with the intrinsic pathway. All right, this is the longer pathway, so that's why we're going to start off with it first. So the intrinsic pathway is actually activated by a damaged endothelium. Inside of the vessel wall. And now this damaged endothelium leads to an exposure of subendothelial collagen, and therefore von Willebrand factor can bind, lead to platelet aggregation, activation as well as aggregation. Von Willebrand factor will bind with the help of cofactor 8. It will allow for platelet activation as well as aggregation. And that aggregation will lead to the coagulation cascade. So, damaged endothelium. It will lead to activation of factor 12. And these factors that are activated is always going to be shown by an A, little a. Okay? So, once you damage endothelium, you activate factor 12. Now, there are some cases, which we'll go over a little bit later, where you have a factor 12 deficiency, which is essentially the first step of the pathway. You can still undergo the intrinsic pathway. I'm going to explain that a little bit later. So, once you have factor 12 activation, then you move on to factor 11. It ends up activating factor 11, which again, we'll denote that with little a. Factor 11 is actually the reason that factor 12 deficiency doesn't really do much. And that's because it can be the start of the intrinsic pathway when factor 12 isn't present. That is due to thrombin's upregulatory effect on some of the factors. And I'll go into that a little bit later as well. So, factor 11 would then activate factor 9. Now, factor 9 will actually lead to the activation of factor 10, right? But in order to do that, what does it need? It needs an activated cofactor 8. So, 9 plus an activated cofactor 8 would cause activation of factor 10. All right. So, after activation of factor 10, what do you want to do? You want to activate prothrombin, which is factor 2, or the precursor to thrombin. So, in order to do that, you're going to be doing the same thing. It's going to bind a cofactor, not factor 8 though. It's going to bind cofactor 5, and then cofactor 5 and factor 10 are going to lead to the activation of thrombin from prothrombin. And again, thrombin is also called factor 2. Since it's activated, thrombin is the active form, it's going to be 2 alpha. Prothrombin is just going to be 2. Okay, so you may have heard that 10 is a part of the common pathway simply because it's the first factor among the intrinsic and extrinsic pathway that are similar between the two. So after thrombin, fibrinogen turning into fibrin. And now fibrin is factor 1A. That would mean fibrinogen is factor 1. Now, fibrin is essentially going to be almost your ultimate goal in terms of coagulation because you're trying to form a fibrin clot, right? So what you want after you start producing this fibrin or you start activating this fibrin is you want it to cross-link, polymerize and cross-link. So in order to polymerize and cross-link, right, it needs a factor. All right, what factor would that be? It would be factor 13. Factor 13 is really important with fibrin cross-linking, all right? Now, what have you noticed are the most important parts of the intrinsic pathway? Factor 11, because in the absence of factor 12, it can still do its job. You have factor 8A, because without factor or cofactor 8A, you can't activate factor 10. And factor 5A, because without factor 5A, you cannot activate thrombin. And just a quick note, y'all, if human, mice, or whatever were to have a thrombin deficiency, they can't live. Thrombin deficiency is incompatible with life. And I'll do a separate video on thrombin just to highlight all the significant mechanisms that it goes through and explain why thrombin deficiency would be incompatible with life, right? But thrombin actually upregulates the three that we went over. Thrombin actually upregulates factors 5, it upregulates factor 8, and it upregulates factor 11. On top of that, thrombin also upregulates factor 13. So some of the four most important molecules in this coagulation cascade, the intrinsic pathway, again, 11, 8, 5, and 13 are upregulated by thrombin. So that is the reason why factor 12 deficiency is of no consequence when it comes to coagulation, right? It's not like hemophilia A or B, which is factor 8 and 9 deficiencies respectively. You won't have anticoagulatory effects. You'll actually have procoagulatory effects, and you'll have problems with clotting, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But as of right now, remember, thrombin, factor 2A, when activated or in its active form, it'll upregulate factors 5, factors 8, factors 11, and factors 13. Okay? So now let's get into the extrinsic pathway. Extrinsic pathway starts out with vascular damage of this connective tissue. So it's not the endothelium like in the intrinsic, but it's the smooth muscle and fibroblasts and other connective tissue that is beneath the endothelium. So when you have that vascular damage of the connective tissue, you're going to release tissue factor, otherwise known as factor 3. Please don't get this wrong on a test, y'all. I've always thought it was factor 7, but it's factor 3. Now, tissue factor actually forms a complex with factor 7, which activates factor 7. Now, factor 7, tissue factor, factor 7A, and then we got plus tissue factor because it's a complex. This complex will then do the same thing as factor 9A, factor 8A. This complex will activate factor 10. Cofactor 5 will then bind the activated factor 10, cleaving prothrombin, activating it into thrombin, which will lead to activation of fibrin and then cross-linking and polymerization of that fibrin. So I'm going to come here, deposit right there. And it's going to go through the rest of the pathway like that. And remember, y'all, this is the coagulation cascade in vivo or inside the body, whether that be mice, human, whatever. But in a laboratory setting, and I'm going to write that in a different. So hopefully y'all can see this, but in a lab setting, the intrinsic pathway is usually brought on by negatively charged particles, and researchers actually use something called glass beads. These glass beads have negatively charged surfaces, which lead to an activation of the intrinsic pathway. And also in a laboratory setting with the extrinsic pathway, the researcher or the scientist can just inject tissue factor or add tissue factor to the sample. That's about it, y'all. As long as you remember that the most important factors in this coagulation cascade are factors 11, cofactor 8, cofactor 5, and factors 13, and that is because thrombin actually leads to an upregulation of those factors. Thrombin will upregulate factor 13, it'll upregulate factor 5, factor 8, as well as factor 11. And just so you know. And as you can see, this just basically causes a positive feedback. So you are continuously activating the previous stages of this cascade in order to continue getting the downstream effects of it. And so that's why it's important when you have coagulation to have very strong anticoagulant factors, right? And I'm gonna do a separate video on that. We're gonna talk about protein C, protein S, we're gonna talk about tissue factor pathway inhibitor, we're gonna talk about plasmin, and with that tissue plasminogen activator inhibitor, alpha-2 antiplasmin, as well as thrombomodulin and antithrombin 3. Stay tuned for the next video, y'all. I'll see you next time.